On the 8th day of May in the year 1945, the continent rejoiced. Victory in Europe Day dawned with pealing church bells and fluttering banners from London to Paris and New York. Yet, thousands of miles away, amidst the tranquil farmlands of Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, the news of the war's conclusion arrived in a markedly different fashion. Within compounds encircled by formidable barbed wire, the cessation of hostilities was not heralded by overflowing champagne bottles or jubilant parades, but by a concise declaration from the lips of American officers. Addressing assemblies of prisoners, men and women alike, they delivered the simple words, "You are free to go home." These pronouncements, which should have resonated as pure salvation, the long-anticipated promise of liberation, were instead met with a profound and unsettling silence. The quiet that followed spoke volumes, a stillness more potent than any fanfare. German women, many in their 20s, some considerably older, met each other's gazes with downcast eyes. A few heads shook in gentle negation, their soft whispers in their native tongue, Heim, nein. They had been transported across the vast ocean under a cloud of suspicion and apprehension. Some had served as support staff within the Luftwaffe Communications Corps, others as nurses who had accompanied the Warem, and a few found themselves swept into captivity simply by proximity to the wrong military unit. These were women who had harbored the conviction that capture by the enemy would inevitably result in cruel treatment. Nazi propaganda had relentlessly portrayed Americans as savage brutes, unfeeling destroyers devoid of compassion. The transatlantic voyage aboard troop transports painted in somber gray had been steeped in a palpable dread. However, the months that followed steadily dismantled every preconceived notion. The camps situated in the American Midwest, while hardly opulent, were characterized by orderliness, cleanliness, and, most astonishingly, an abundance of food. One young captive, barely exceeding 22 years of age, had painstakingly recorded in a worn notebook, "They provide us with peanut butter, sticky, peculiar, yet rich. I can't stop consuming it." Her handwriting, delicate and somewhat jagged, conveyed not gratitude, but sheer astonishment, as if even experiencing delight felt like a betrayal of the world she had left behind. Another woman, who had previously worked as a typist in a Luftwaffe administrative office, recounted to a Red Cross representative that she had been issued a new pair of shoes upon her arrival. She had not possessed a new pair since 1941. These might seem like minor comforts, but in a war-ravaged Europe where families subsisted on boiled nettles for their evening meal and footwear was repaired until only patches remained, these were luxuries almost beyond comprehension. When the officers delivered their pronouncement on that vernal morning, an eruption of unrestrained joy was anticipated by many. Instead, the reaction proved perplexing. A captain stationed in Texas would later recall his bewilderment, stating, "I assumed they would rush the gates." Some women did weep, but their tears were not born of happiness. They stemmed from a heavier, more complex emotion. For these women, the prospect of returning home signified a re-entry into a world that had been almost entirely obliterated. Letters, clandestinely passed through censorship, spoke of streets reduced to rubble, of vanished relatives, and of towns parceled out into occupation zones. One communication, read aloud by a trembling 26-year-old in the barracks, detailed the plight of her mother, starving in Hamburg, and her brother missing somewhere in Russia. The notion of going home no longer evoked images of reunion. It conjured specters of devastation, gnawing hunger, and persistent fear. The stark contrast between the spoken words, "You can go," and the subsequent quiet refusal illuminated a truth that both sides found difficult to grasp. These women, essentially captives in a foreign territory, had begun to perceive their very confinement as a sanctuary. Behind the wire, they were undoubtedly observed, but they were also sheltered, their hunger sated, and, at times, their dignity unexpectedly restored. They were even afforded opportunities for employment. In Kansas, farming families observed with a measure of suspicion as formations of German women marched into the fields to diligently harvest sugar beets. However, this suspicion gradually eroded as the women themselves found amusement in the seemingly endless rows, exchanging jests in broken English, that America possessed more corn than soldiers. Even under constraint, a sense of humor had begun to re-emerge. The American Guards were not oblivious to this subtle transformation. A sergeant serving in Iowa would later confide, They appeared so youthful at Quegawa, one almost forgot they were the enemy. As night descended, melodies would drift from the barracks. Accordions, brought all the way from Europe, filled the tranquil air above the vast prairie. For fleeting moments, the music transcended nationality, sounding neither German nor American, but purely human. And within this shared humanity, something profoundly intricate began to take root. Nevertheless, the directives were unambiguous. The provisions of the Geneva Convention mandated repatriation. The United States harbored no intention of detaining its prisoners of war, particularly the women, any longer than absolutely necessary. Yet, what the officers failed to foresee was the emergence of resistance to freedom itself. One lieutenant in Texas, visibly flustered by the sight of prisoners weeping at his announcement, repeated the words with an earnestness that suggested he believed a second utterance might alter their meaning. "You can go home," he insisted, his voice firm. However, a woman positioned at the forefront of the group gently shook her head, articulating in halting English, "Home? There is no home left." This single sentence shattered all illusions. America could indeed unlock the gates, but what lay beyond them was not a welcoming homeland awaiting with open arms. It was a landscape of utter desolation. Within the Soviet-occupied territories, whispers of widespread atrocities spread through the camps like an uncontrolled conflagration. Even in the western zones, the scarcity of provisions was a persistent reality. Cities stood as blackened skeletons, and millions wandered as displaced individuals. To depart from the camp in Iowa for destinations like Bremen or Dresden was not liberation. It was an exile into an existential void. The sheer peculiarity of the moment is difficult to overstate. Officers stood in a state of bewildered confusion, their uniforms bearing the dust of long service, their orders clear and precise, while before them stood women who should have eagerly boarded the trains eastward, but instead pleaded to remain behind the barbed wire within the domain of their conquerors. The irony was so potent, it almost stung. America, once depicted as a monstrous entity in Nazi propaganda, had, for these women, transformed into the sole sanctuary they felt they could trust. A young guard, no older than 19, would later articulate his feelings in a letter home. "I never imagined the enemy would implore me to keep them as prisoners. But some of the girls weep at the thought of returning. They are safer here than they would be free out there." He confessed that this observation haunted him. The war had inverted the world, and here was its undeniable proof. Captivity embraced, freedom feared. This scene unfolded in camp after camp across the heartland of America. Not all resisted the repatriation. Some were consumed by a desperate yearning to discover what remained of their families and their homes. However, a sufficient number pleaded to remain behind that the officers began to comprehend the profound depth of devastation that had engulfed Europe. Each petition, each quiet refusal, spoke less of loyalty to Germany and more of sheer terror at what Germany had become. These women were not clinging to their captors. They were clinging to the last bastion where life felt even remotely bearable. When the announcement concluded and the officers dismissed the assembled prisoners, the women did not disperse with exultant haste. They returned to their barracks slowly, subdued, carrying questions far heavier than the meager belongings they had once hauled across the European continent. That night, lights burned late within the barracks. Some women meticulously penned letters, their script neat and precise, inquiring of relatives whether even a single roof still stood to return to. Others simply sat in quiet contemplation, their gazes fixed on the humble wooden walls as if attempting to quantify the immeasurable distance between the barbed wire and true freedom. And so, a narrative began to unfold, not one of liberation in its conventional sense, but of an unexpected conflict, the profound desire to remain incarcerated, to willingly trade a shattered homeland for the precarious safety of a foreign detention. The officers had delivered their mandated decree, "You can go home." But for many of these women, that phrase carried no promise of a brighter future, only the chilling specter of dread. In the weeks that followed, petitions would be drafted, impassioned arguments would be made, and tears would flow copiously. The world at large anticipated that prisoners would ardently crave release, but the reality proved to be far more astonishing. The gates of the camp stood open, and yet a significant number chose to remain within. What transpired next would astound even the officers themselves. The camps where the German women resided were never intended to serve as permanent residences. Yet, For a considerable number, they evolved into something approaching stability, offering a sense of order that far surpassed anything awaiting them across the vast ocean. Rows of neatly constructed wooden barracks stood against the boundless horizons of the American Midwest. Mornings commenced with the resonant clang of a bell, the aroma of boiled coffee wafting from the guards' quarters, and the distinct shuffle of boots on gravel as the prisoners filed out for their assigned work details. To any observer from the outside, it presented the clear appearance of incarceration. To the women within, however, it felt, in a strangely profound way, like survival. The rhythm of their daily lives unfolded with little connection to the ongoing war. In Texas, women rose with the dawn to peel mountains of potatoes in the camp kitchens, the air thick with the starchy scent in the humid climate. In Iowa, under close supervision, they toiled in the fields, bending over rows of corn and sugar beets, their dresses clinging to sweat-soaked skin beneath the fierce sun. American families, at times, watched from a distance, their weary eyes peering from front porches, anticipating signs of defiance or acts of sabotage. What they witnessed instead was laughter carried on the breeze. Women conversed in German, occasionally daring to mimic the English phrases they overheard. A farmer, half-jokingly, once remarked to a guard, "If they continue working at this pace, I'll hire them permanently after the war." Small gestures of kindness began to emerge, subtly circumventing official boundaries. A guard in Kansas discreetly slipped an apple to a prisoner during a long, arduous day in the field. She bit into it slowly, savoring the crisp sweetness, and later recorded in her diary, "It tasted of peace." Another young woman, formerly a typist in Stuttgart, vividly recalled her first experience entering an American grocery store under the escort of a guard. Rows upon rows of canned goods gleamed under the bright electric lights. Soap was stacked in impressive towers, and fabrics were folded in a vibrant spectrum of colors. "I thought it was a dream," she confessed years later, "to witness such an abundance of everything." The sheer plenty mocked her memories of her homeland, where queues of people stretched through rubble-strewn streets, all vying for a few meager ounces of flour. The disparity between their expectations and the unfolding reality grew more pronounced with each passing month. The women had been thoroughly indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda, which had relentlessly asserted that American captivity meant barbarity, starvation, and perhaps even death. Instead, they found themselves receiving 3 meals daily, often amounting to as much as 3,200 calories, according to reports from the Red Cross. This was considerably more than most civilians in Germany had consumed in the final years of the war, when rations had dwindled to near starvation levels. Meat graced their plates, the bread was soft and white, and for the first time in years, they were able to wash their hair with actual soap. The irony was not lost on them. One woman remarked to her barrack mates that she had experienced better nourishment within the confines of barbed wire than she ever had in her own home. The Americans, too, underwent a recalibration of their perceptions. Initially, suspicion permeated the atmosphere. To many guards, a German uniform, even when worn by a woman, carried the same stigma as a weapon. However, gradually, distance gave way to a form of recognition. They observed the weariness etched onto the women's faces, the palpable longing when letters arrived from overseas, and the way they clutched photographs of their families, worn soft and faded at the edges. A sergeant from Oklahoma remembered his internal monologue. "They look no older than my sister. How could I possibly consider them the enemy?" The lines between adversary and individual blurred, though this shift was never officially acknowledged. Music emerged as a vital bridge across the divide. As night fell, the women would gather in their barracks, one perhaps playing an accordion, another keeping a rhythmic beat on the wooden frame of a bed. Songs filled the air, a blend of traditional German folk tunes and hymns recollected from childhood. Guards on patrol would sometimes pause to listen, the melancholic notes drifting into the vast expanse of the prairie night. For the women, this was a crucial means of preserving their humanity, a way to remind themselves that beyond the barbed wire, life still held an inherent melody. Not all aspects of their experience were smooth. Profound loneliness often pressed heavily upon them, and tempers would occasionally flare in the close confines of their living quarters. Disputes erupted over the arrival of letters, over shared memories, and over the unsettling rumors circulating about their impending return to Germany. Yet, Even these moments served to deepen the central paradox. Within the fences of the camp, they argued like neighbors rather than like prisoners. In a certain sense, they had forged a fragile community, bound together by a shared sense of uncertainty and an unexpected discovery of their own inherent dignity. A resilient humor, born of survival, threaded its way through their daily routines. They teased each other about their accented English, laughed heartily at the unending meals of cornbread, and jokingly remarked on the American penchant for incorporating corn into nearly every dish. One woman, standing knee-deep in a field in Iowa, threw her hands up in exasperation and declared, "If the war doesn't claim me, then corn will." The guard standing beside her could not suppress a chuckle. It was a small moment, to be sure, but it served to chip away at the formidable walls that both sides had erected. Yet, beneath the surface of laughter and steady work, shadows continued to linger. News filtered in from Europe, and each report cast a darker pall over the barracks. Cities reduced to dust by relentless bombing, families lost in the eastern territories, and the slow, grinding hunger that continued to devour what little remained of the Reich. The women would compare these harrowing accounts with the warm meals placed before them, and these comparisons etched a new and profound fear within them. Freedom, they now understood, meant leaving behind the only place where they were assured of safety and sustenance. The internal conflict became increasingly evident as the months progressed. Guards began to notice tears shed during mail call, women clinging to their letters as if to prevent the paper itself from being swept away by the wind. One guard recalled observing a prisoner standing silently for an entire hour at the fence line, her gaze fixed westward, as if trying to commit the outline of the American horizon to memory. It was not affection for the country that held her captive. It was a deep-seated dread of the one that awaited her beyond its borders. The camps transformed into paradoxical spaces. They were prisons that nourished, walls that protected rather than confined. The women themselves became living embodiments of contradiction. Soldiers without weapons, captives who harbored a fear of release. The officers struggled to reconcile these observations. Why, they pondered, would anyone choose to remain behind barbed wire rather than claim their liberty? The answer gradually clarified with each personal testimony they heard, for the world beyond the camp fences had effectively collapsed. Within this profound paradox lay the very heart of their remarkable story. They were not rejecting their homeland in a spirit of disloyalty. They were rejecting the utter desolation that awaited them there. They were not embracing America out of fervent affection. They were clinging to the last vestiges of security they could possibly find. And as the officers began to prepare for the inevitable process of repatriation, the quiet pleas started to surface. Some were whispered in broken English, while others were painstakingly scrawled onto scraps of paper. "Please, let us stay." It was an extraordinary plea for prisoners to make, one that deeply unsettled the officers who heard it. Captivity had become their refuge, and freedom, paradoxically, had become their greatest fear. The irony was sharp, the kind that history reserves for moments of almost cruel poignancy. The barbed wire, originally intended to divide and separate, had inadvertently become their protective shield, and soon, as the orders for their transport loomed closer, those shields would be unceremoniously stripped away. The women were acutely aware of this impending reality, and the guards, though perhaps not fully comprehending, suspected it too. What followed would test both sides in ways neither had anticipated. The first trains destined for the east stood ready in the summer of 1946, their iron wheels gleaming under the vast prairie sun. For the American officers, the mission appeared straightforward: repatriate the prisoners in accordance with the requirements of the Geneva Convention, and restore a semblance of order by returning them to the soil of their native land. But for the women who had resided behind the wire for a year or more, the prospect of stepping onto those trains instilled a dread more potent than captivity itself. The letters that had arrived from Europe had already painted a vivid, nightmarish picture. Hamburg was a city of charred brick structures. Dresden still smoldered from the relentless bombing. Cologne was described not as a city, but as a desolate lunar landscape punctuated by skeletal chimneys. Even the western zones, under the governance of British and American forces, struggled under the weight of severe shortages. Families bartered precious heirlooms for mere potatoes. Children would faint in their classrooms from the pangs of hunger, and a woman might walk 10 miles for a single pound of flour. The prisoners were privy to these harrowing accounts, not through propaganda, but through the ink of trembling hands that had painstakingly penned letters, which then found their way across the Atlantic. Hannelore, a 24-year-old Luafa auxiliary, read aloud to her bunkmates the anguishing words of her mother in Hanover. "Your sister is gone, your father is missing. I sleep in the cellar because the roof is riddled with holes. If you return, I do not know where you will sleep." The letter crumbled in her grasp, but the chilling terror in her voice lingered long after the paper was carefully folded away. Another woman collapsed in tears upon learning that her ancestral village had been swallowed by the relentless Soviet advance. She whispered to a guard in halting English, "My home no longer exists." To the officers, the concept of returning home was a matter of logistical planning. To the women, it represented a sentence to wander aimlessly among ruins, perpetually begging for meager sustenance. One camp commandant would later confess that these pleas unsettled him far more than any outright defiance could have. It was infinitely easier to confront hatred than to witness profound despair. Some women embarked on the arduous process of submitting petitions, their notes hastily scrawled, pleading for an extension of their captivity or for work contracts within the United States. Others pursued even more desperate avenues, volunteering their services as nurses in American hospitals, or offering to meticulously clean barracks, simply to remain within the perceived safety of the camp perimeter. A select few even inquired about the possibility of marrying their way into American citizenship, though official regulations at the time rendered such requests impossible to fulfill. What intensified their fear was the looming specter of the Soviet zone. Whispers and fragmented reports trickled into the camps, detailing mass reprisals, of women forcibly dragged from their cellars, of entire villages emptied under the cover of darkness. Even those women designated for transport to the British or American sectors harbored a profound fear of the journey eastward. The trains, often 4 of them, would deposit their passengers in temporary holding camps, offering little in the way of sustenance and no certainty about their ultimate destinations. A young woman named Latte, who had previously served as a secretary in Bremen, confided to a fellow prisoner that she would infinitely prefer scrubbing floors in Texas for the remainder of her days than risk even a single night in the Soviet zone. Her words resonated among the bunks like a solemn vow, though they all understood, with a heavy heart, that it was a vow she ultimately could not uphold. The irony of the situation was not lost on many of the Americans who overheard these conversations. They had been trained to perceive Germans as fanatically devoted to Hitler, clinging to him until the very bitter end. Instead, they found themselves encountering women who harbored a far greater fear of their own country than they did of the barbed wire surrounding their captors. A 19-year-old guard recounted his astonishment in a letter home. "They are afraid of freedom. Can you even imagine? They weep at the thought of returning. They claim there is nothing left there, no food, nothing to live for. Some of them would genuinely prefer to remain our prisoners indefinitely." Even the minutiae of daily life served to underscore the vast chasm separating America from Germany. A prisoner in Kansas marveled at the luxury of being able to wash with soap on a weekly basis. Her sister, writing from Frankfurt, reported that she had not been able to bathe in months, as water was exceedingly scarce and soap virtually non-existent. In Oklahoma, women sang to the rhythmic pulse of accordion music. In Berlin, survivors huddled in damp cellars, listening to the groaning symphony of collapsing structures. These stark comparisons haunted them. Captivity, once an object of profound fear, had inexplicably become the sole realm where life retained a semblance of rhythm and nourishment. And yet, the orders arrived with unwavering bureaucratic precision. Trains would depart according to schedule, ships would ferry them across the Atlantic, and the United States Army would consider its duty discharged. During briefings, officers consistently reiterated the notion that the women should be profoundly grateful for their impending release. Few, if any, genuinely considered what awaited them on the opposite side of the vast ocean. The women themselves grappled with the arduous task of envisioning it, stepping off a ship into Bremerhaven, only to discover strangers sifting through the rubble where their childhood homes once proudly stood. Would their mothers still be alive? Would their children, if they had any, even recognize them? These questions weighed so heavily upon them that many lay awake in the barracks night after night, their gazes fixed on the wooden ceiling beams, listening to the quiet sighs of their neighbors, who, like them, could find no restful sleep. One night in Iowa, a fierce storm lashed against the barracks, rain hammering relentlessly on the roof, wind rattling the shutters with violent force. Inside, the women huddled together, their voices hushed and low. They spoke not of joyous homecomings, but of pervasive fears. "We will be utterly forgotten," one woman declared, her voice trembling. Another murmured, with a profound sense of resignation, "We will return as paupers." A third whispered the darkest thought of all, a sentiment that hung heavy in the air. It would be better to remain a prisoner than to be free amidst such desolation. The lightning cracked violently across the prairie sky, momentarily illuminating their pale, drawn faces. For that fleeting instant, they appeared less like captives and more like exiles, awaiting a judgment they could not comprehend. The Americans attempted to offer reassurances. A chaplain earnestly addressed the prisoners, speaking of the potential for rebuilding, of Germany's eventual resurgence. His words, though sincere, carried no tangible comfort. They offered no bread, no shelter, no true safety. The women nodded politely, their expressions conveying a practiced acquiescence. But afterward, one confided to a friend, "It is easy enough to speak of rebuilding when your home has not been reduced to ashes." This simple sentence encapsulated the profound weariness of an entire generation, watching their country vanish before their very eyes. As their departure approached, the women underwent a palpable shift. Their movement towards roll call became more measured, their time spent by the fences extended, and their gazes lingered on the American vista they were soon to relinquish. Some of the guards, seasoned by years of service, found themselves unexpectedly touched by the scene. One recounted a vivid memory of a young woman tracing the barbed wire with her finger, as if attempting to imprint its texture onto her soul, her final tether before being plunged into the unknown. He would later pen, "I had always assumed prisons were meant to confine individuals against their volition. Yet, these women seemed to hold on to the very concept of the prison itself." The concluding days within the camp were imbued with a silent, pervasive disquiet. Officially, this period was designated as liberation. In reality, it signaled an enforced return to utter desolation. The women carefully gathered the meager possessions they had accumulated, a knitted scarf from their confinement, a photograph of a guard's child, a gesture of unexpected goodwill, and a worn notebook filled with diary entries detailing their daily existence. The scarcity of soap and corn, the melodies that drifted through the air. Each item felt imbued with a weight far exceeding its physical form, as each represented a life on the precipice of erasure. When the trains finally sounded their whistles, the mournful cry carried a dual resonance of both release and apprehension. The officers perceived themselves as fulfilling their assigned duties. The women, however, experienced this as a step into a profound state of exile. As they boarded, some with tears tracing paths down their cheeks, a stark and undeniable contradiction lay bare for history to witness. Freedom, ostensibly offered, was inwardly spurned, for the gates of their confinement were indeed closing. Yet what lay beyond them was a reality far more bleak, and the world was soon to learn the extent to which many had pleaded not to be set free. The initial trains departed the camps with groaning wheels and trailing plumes of smoke. However, it was not the departures themselves that were etched most deeply into memory, but rather the faces pressed against the train windows. American guards, their dispositions hardened by years of conflict, later confessed they had anticipated witnessing expressions of joy, or at the very least, relief on the women's faces. Instead, they observed countenances etched with distress, their eyes fixed on the receding barbed wire, withdrawing into the distance as if being forcibly severed from a semblance of safety. This profound paradox deeply unsettled the men who bore witness. These individuals, who had arrived as adversaries, were now departing as reluctant exiles, exhibiting a tenacity towards their confinement that no one could have possibly foreseen. For certain women, their appeals to remain had been meticulously penned and nervously presented to the officers. They implored to continue their duties within the camp kitchens, to undertake the arduous task of scrubbing floors, to tend the gardens, and to remain in America, even if it meant enduring life behind the wire. A select few even ventured to propose more audacious futures, proposals of marriage to their guards, formal agreements for domestic employment, or aspirations for lives lived within the very nation that had once been portrayed as the embodiment of the enemy. While regulations rendered such requests infeasible, the very act of articulating them revealed a profound truth. Confinement had ceased to be perceived as a punitive measure. It had transformed into a protective sanctuary from a world engulfed in ruin. The officers privy to these petitions grappled with the immense weight of their implications. One captain stationed in Kansas recalled his profound bewilderment, stating, "We informed them they were liberated, and they implored us to keep them bound." To him, freedom represented an absolute, the innate desire of every captive. Yet, these women had come to define freedom through an entirely different lens, not as the mere opening of a gate, but as the assurance of security, sustenance, and inherent worth. These assurances, paradoxically, resided not in Germany, but within the confines of the American Midwest. Their curious attachment to their confinement stemmed not from affection for America, though some women did express fondness for its expansive skies, its seemingly endless fields of corn, and the melodies emanating from radios in nearby towns. What they cherished above all was the simple act of survival. Within the boundaries of the wire, they had rediscovered the fundamental meaning of warmth, of regular meals, and of being treated with a basic level of humanity. A stark contrast to the indignity of being viewed as mere burdens in a nation ravaged by starvation and relentless bombing. One former prisoner eloquently summarized this sentiment years later with quiet finality. "In America, I was a prisoner, but in Germany, I would have been nothing." Nevertheless, the currents of history were inexorable. The Geneva Convention mandated the repatriation of prisoners by the United States, and the bureaucratic machinery of war moved with unyielding momentum. Shipments of prisoners sailed back towards Bremerhaven and Hamburg, where families or even strangers awaited them on desolate docks, some clutching names on scraps of paper, others standing in silent, hollow-eyed anticipation. The women disembarked from the gangplanks and were immediately engulfed by a homeland utterly alien to them, its streets scorched, its homes reduced to skeletal remains, its people gaunt and emaciated. Those who had desperately pleaded to remain in America found their gravest fears realized. Yet, their experience of confinement had left an indelible mark, shaping them in ways that would endure. A considerable number of these women, once resettled, began to harbor a yearning to return, not to the barbed wire, but to the nation that had unexpectedly offered them a measure of kindness. In the 1950s, when emigration to the United States became permissible once more under specialized visas, some of these former prisoners eagerly submitted their applications. A select few were successful, undertaking the voyage across the ocean anew, this time not as captives, but as immigrants seeking the land where they had first experienced the profound sensation of survival. Their narratives, preserved in fragmented oral histories and familial records, bear witness to a peculiar truth. The recollection of their confinement had, in essence, become a pathway to a sense of belonging. For those who ultimately remained in Germany, their time in captivity persisted in their memories as a period marked by both profound bitterness and an unexpected sweetness. They recalled the sting of defeat, the degradation of being under guard, but also the astonishing abundance of meals that were simply too plentiful to consume, the shared laughter over their attempts at clumsy English phrases, and the late-night songs that ascended into the vast prairie air. These seemingly contradictory elements did not negate one another. They coexisted, fundamentally shaping a generation of women who came to understand that freedom was not always a simple proposition, and captivity was not invariably a cruel fate. The Americans, too, were irrevocably altered. Guards who had once harbored fear or contempt for their prisoners returned home with accounts of women who wept at the mere prospect of leaving. One sergeant recounted to his children decades later, "I witnessed the enemy pleading to remain my prisoner. That was the moment I comprehended the sheer brokenness of their world." For him, the lasting memory was not one of victory, but of profound tragedy, recalling the sight of young women clinging to prison fences as if they were literal lifelines. Even within the camps, the women's adherence to their confined existence possessed a quiet, almost sacred significance. They meticulously maintained their living quarters, planted small blossoms outside the barracks, and imposed order upon a situation that demanded none. It was as if they instinctively understood that for as long as the fences remained, they could carve out a fragile semblance of dignity, a collective existence centered on survival, To venture beyond those barriers meant relinquishing all of that to a homeland where even basic necessities like shelter and food had become unattainable luxuries. The barbed wire, once a stark emblem of subjugation, had been re-envisioned as the very outline of sanctuary. The narrative is steeped in an irony so potent that it cannot be overlooked. American officers, steadfast believers in freedom as an inherent gift, were compelled to witness their charges recoiling from its embrace. German women, who had once lived under a regime that proclaimed a millennium of glory, now clung to the daily mercies extended by a foreign adversary. Freedom equated to hunger, captivity represented survival. History undeniably revels in paradoxes, yet few resonate as deeply as this particular one. And so, the narrative circles back to those poignant words spoken in 1945. You can go home. They were intended to signify an opening, a release. Yet, for a significant number, they sounded like a final pronouncement, a sentence. In the years that followed, some women did indeed manage to rebuild their lives in Germany. Others departed at the earliest opportunity, pursuing the lingering echo of the country where, for the first time in many years, they had known a sense of security. Their allegiance to their confinement was less an expression of gratitude towards America than a desperate act born of profound desperation, the fundamental human instinct to cling to safety wherever it might manifest. Even now, the image remains remarkably vivid. Women standing at the perimeter of the wire, their gazes directed not eastward towards Europe, but westward, towards the distant horizon, towards a land they could not claim, yet could never forget. Their fidelity to their captivity was, in its truest essence, a testament to their loyalty to life itself. It serves as a profound reminder that freedom is never merely the absence of physical constraints, but rather the presence of inherent dignity, unwavering safety, and enduring hope. And as the final gates reverberated shut, with the ships that would carry them home already poised and waiting, a single question hung in the air, dissipating like smoke over a ravaged battlefield. What did home truly signify to those who no longer recognized it?